Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for yet another extremely topical and extremely timely AMET webinar. As most of you know, AMET is an unabashedly pro-American and pro-Israel think tank and policy institute in Washington, D.C. We're listed as a tax-deductible 501c3 by the U.S. Internal Revenue Service. And if you like our continuous programming, we encourage you to please consider a tax-deductible contribution to AMET. Many of us have been following in minute detail every piece of news that has been leaking out about the on-again, off-again negotiations in Vienna regarding the Islamic Republic of Iran and its intent to build a nuclear bomb. Since President Biden had announced in April of 2021 that his team was going to resume their negotiations, AMET has had well over 460 meetings with members of Congress and mostly with their foreign policy staffers about some of the details that have been leaking out. Of course, when Secretary of State Antony Blinken first appeared before Congress in January of 2021 for his confirmation hearings, we were promised a, quote, longer and stronger deal. Many of us had hoped that this new deal might address the fatal flaws of the original JCPA, including the looming sunset clauses, some of which have already lapsed, Iran's missile and drone development, and its support for its terrorist proxies throughout the globe, and its malign activity throughout the region. However, as time has lapsed, news has begun to leak out that this longer, stronger deal has become a shorter and weaker deal. And during all of this time of the negotiations, the centrifuges have continued to spin. Iran now has 2 tons of highly enriched uranium at the 60% level, enough, according to Chief Nuclear Physicist David Albright of what is known as the Good ISIS, the Institute for Science and International Security, for 1 bomb. Meanwhile, all sanctions have been suspended as an act of quote unquote good faith during these negotiations. And according to former member of the Iran desk at the US State Department and great American hero Gabe Naranha, we've not been enforcing our trade sanctions, and Iran has amassed $10 to $20 billion in trade during this period, slightly over a year of the negotiations. What is even more concerning to us is that during the period that Russian President Vladimir Putin had announced his intention to invade Ukraine, which has been a watershed event, totally upending the post-World War II liberal world order. And when he has executed this war, or while he has executed this war, which has been a complete humanitarian catastrophe of indescribable proportions, we have allowed the Russian emissary to the talks in Vienna, Mikhail Ulyanov, to be our water carrier in these talks. Most of you by now have seen the YouTube video of Mr. Ulyanov positively gloating at the degree of concessions that he and his Chinese colleague have been able to extract from the United States towards Iran and Vienna. In some of my articles on this, I have called this subcontracting to Russia the height of diplomatic malpractice. On May 10th, the director of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, had announced to the European Union that they have found traces of highly enriched uranium on 4 additional undisclosed sites. And recently, new satellite imagery has revealed major excavations underway in Iran's Natanz nuclear facilities. These new facilities are projected to be operational later this year and will be the deepest, most secure facilities to date. It's suspected the new facilities will house up to 1,000 new advanced centrifuges that Iran is currently manufacturing. And finally, as we are talking today, many of the streets of Iran have been erupted in what began as protests over food prices, but which has morphed into into calls of down with Khomeini, down with Khamenei, down with the regime. Yesterday, the Iranian regime decided to unleash at least 50,000 members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Basij force against these incredibly brave dissidents. One has to ask why we're ignoring the voices of these freedom-loving dissidents, willing to take to the streets and risk being carted off to the notorious Evin prison, never to be seen from or heard from again. And why are we trying to appease the reigning mullahs, together with their partners, the Russians and the Chinese? We are profoundly honored today to be able to have with us the marvelous Rich Goldberg from the excellent think tank, the Foundation of Defense of Democracies, with whom we are constantly honored to collaborate closely with. And today, in testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Mark Dubowitz of FDD will be appearing. I have known Rich for many, many years, since he worked under the late, great Congressman and then Senator Mark Kirk. Rich was responsible for drafting the original binding sanctions regime against Iran, which gave businesses and financial institutions the choice. Either you deal with Iran or you deal with the United States. Rich is a senior advisor at FDD. From 2019 to 2020, Richard served as the Director for Countering Iranian Weapons of Mass Destruction for the White House National Security Council. He previously served as Chief of Staff for Illinois Governor Bruce Rauner and Deputy Chief of Staff and Senior Foreign Policy Advisor to former U.S. Senator Mark Kirk of Illinois in both the U.S. House and U.S. Senate. In the Senate, Richard emerged as a leading architect of the toughest sanctions imposed on the Islamic Republic of Iran. He was the lead Republican negotiator for 3 rounds of sanctions targeting the Central Bank of Iran, the SWIFT financial messaging service, and entire sections of the Iranian economy. Richard also drafted and negotiated legislation promoting human rights and democracy in Iran, including sanctions targeting entities that provide the Iranian regime with the tools of repression. His Iran sanctions work was featured in the book, The Iran Wars. Rich, first of all, we're always honored to have you. You are one of America's intellectual treasure houses. How did we get here? And do you know anything that we don't know in terms of the status of the current negotiations?
Well, first of all, it's great to be back. Thank you for having me again, as always, and great to be with the entire audience. Thanks for taking your lunch in a bag to listen to me. Whatever treasure you would have. I don't know about that. I've worked with and for a lot of true treasures. I'm just honored to be here. So I would say, listen, 16 months have gone by since the Biden administration began its endeavor to return to the old 2015 Iran nuclear deal. And it's 16 months, unfortunately, that we haven't just wasted, but that we have lost to the detriment of our national security. Obviously, President Biden campaigned on going back to the Iran nuclear deal. He said that was what he wanted to do. When questioned how that was a good idea, how he could ever achieve objectives if he lifted sanctions and lost all U.S. leverage after the Trump administration had built up historic amounts of economic leverage over the regime, he said, well, we need to do that as a bridge to get to a longer and stronger deal. We'll recall. At the time, the Iranians, up until the end of 2020, had only been enriching at low levels of enrichment in the 3 to 5% range. Suddenly, during the transition, when it was clear President Biden would become the president in January, Iran decided to escalate to 20% enriched uranium, crossing the threshold to high enriched uranium, something they had not done since before the Iran nuclear deal, something that was highly provocative. And this should have prompted a reevaluation, certainly a deadline at the very least, on how long a new administration would give the Iranians to come back to the table and say, we are willing to lift all these sanctions on you. You need to come back into compliance with the old deal. The fact that the Iranians refused to come back to compliance to get all the sanctions relief up front should have been a clear warning sign that the Iranians were playing the administration for time, that in fact they would have a game of escalation, test the administration of whether or not there would be any enforcement of our sanctions, whether there would be a return to the maximum pressure campaign, whether if they attacked U.S. forces in the Middle East militarily through either the IRGC or its proxies, the U.S. military would respond the way the Trump administration did in the killing of Qasem Soleimani. And also we saw attacks on our Gulf allies and on Israel, obviously escalating as well. In Vienna, even though they were escalating first to 20% enriched uranium, then to 60% enriched uranium, again, no enforcement of sanctions during this period. There was no censure resolutions put forward by the US. In fact, the Biden administration pulled back our allies who were going to go forward with censure resolutions at the IAEA at the March board meeting last year, not just because of the escalation of 20% enriched uranium at the time, but more importantly, what you just alluded to, the ongoing investigation into the undeclared nuclear activities and materials in the country, which has now been going on for more than 3 years, this investigation, having found particles of uranium at least 4 sites that are not known to the IAEA previously, have not been declared as part of Iran's nuclear program, which constitutes a clear breach of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, not the JCPOA, the NPT itself, to which the Iranian government is a party. And so, one would say, okay, maybe 3 months, maybe 6 months. Again, it's like, how long would you ever give such a negotiation to go on as the Iranians continue to enrich more and more at higher and higher levels? Then eventually kicking out inspectors from certain sites, holding hostage inspection equipment so that the IAEA couldn't review footage in certain sites. Again, how long would you let this go on for? Drone attacks, missile attacks, rocket attacks against US forces dozens of times in Iraq, coordinated attacks against US forces in Syria, coordinated attacks against our allies in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, maritime traffic, attacks against Israeli vessels, etc. How long would you let this go on for? A reasonable person would ask. Maybe somebody would say a few months. At some point, you'd have to put your foot down and say, we return to maximum pressure. This is not serious. But all along the way, the Iranians said, this is great. There's no enforcement of sanctions. There's no military response to our actions. We can continue to escalate. And our goal is not a return to the JCPOA. Our goal now is a better deal than the JCPOA. More concessions from the United States, more sanctions relief from the United States, and keeping all of the advancements in our nuclear program so we are that much closer to the nuclear threshold if and when we decide we're ready to cut a deal. And unfortunately, 16 months later, that's exactly what we're up against right now, with the Iranians having deployed and tested their most advanced centrifuges, continuing to enrich uranium just a stone's throw away from weapons grade at 60%, operating in multiple facilities. You mentioned the continuing work to excavate Natanz to make that a hardened underground facility, even more perhaps hardened than the Fordo facility we know about near Qom. So this is all very worrisome. Meanwhile, what's going on with that Iran deal? Will it go forward, I think, is the big question mark. Well, what is the deal on the table? Put aside the question of the IRGC for a moment, which I think has captured everyone's attention for the last few weeks. And I would want to come back to 3 important developments on the IRGC, on the nuclear program, and on Russia that I think complicate the way forward for the administration. But just a quick recap of what is on the table right now. We've gotten confirmation now through reports the president has told the Iranians he will not take the IRGC off the foreign terrorist organization list. That is a very good thing. But let's talk about what is on the table still if the Iranians say yes, because there is still an offer on the table. Going back to the Iran nuclear deal of 2015 as a starting point, you keep all the initial sunsets in place. So starting in 2020, the arms embargo has lifted already. Next year, a missile embargo lifts. Next October, by the way, the United States is required to seek the repeal of all statutory sanctions on Iran. That's unlikely to happen, especially if the Republicans take the House of Representatives. So we are, by the way, facing a crisis next October if we keep these sunsets in place. 2025, the snapback of UN sanctions, the ability to actually reimpose all international restrictions on Iran goes away. That itself is sunset. And then you're also through 2024 and beyond into allowing Iran to do what it's already doing today, which is today illicit and a breach of the JCPOA, but just in a few short years actually is fully allowed under the JCPOA anyways. And by 2031, you have the ability on the Iranian side, the right to enrich all the way up to weapons grade uranium. Their only commitment permanently, if you want to take them at face value, they take them at their word, is that they won't build a nuclear bomb. Well, that's not much assurance from a regime that has covered up and concealed their nuclear program at every step, and to this day continues to conceal undeclared nuclear activities, according to the IAEA. What does Iran get for this? Well, the restrictions on its missile program remain non-existent. Restrictions on its support for terrorism remain non-existent. All those sunsets remain in place, and they get access to more than $100 billion per year in revenue coming into them. By some estimates, $800 billion between now and the end of the JCPOA sunsets in 2031, allowing them to invest in their longer and longer range nuclear capable ballistic missiles, their cruise missiles, their UAV program, their sponsorship of terrorism, and of course the repression of the Iranian people, not to mention the buildup of the nuclear program itself to be ready to cross the nuclear threshold at a time of their choosing. Okay, that's in the deal, regardless of whether or not the IRGC is on the FTO list or not. It's a terrible deal on the table. But let's talk about three important developments here that I think are in front of the Biden administration right now as they start to face a Hamlet-type moment. To deal or not to deal? That is the question before President Biden, as the title of this seminar said. Number one, the Russian invasion of Ukraine set off a real interest and a real sunshine on all the areas the United States and the international community have been working with the Russians behind the scenes quietly. When we say we're going to make Russia a pariah state, that begs the question, where are we still cooperating with Russia? Where is Russia sneaking around to our disadvantage? Where have we allowed them or enabled them to go? Well, one of those places that was listed on the State Department list of exempted activities to continue working with Russia on just a couple months ago was the JCPOA negotiations. And in fact, we learned that Mikhail Ulyanov, the Russian ambassador in Vienna, if you follow my Twitter feed or his, you'll see he's one of my favorite fans, likes to troll me incessantly on Twitter, has for the last several years. It's interestingly coordinated with the Iranians. He will tweet on me something negative just to troll me, and the Tehran Times will pick it up with a screaming headline: Russian ambassador slams former Trump administration official and FDD advisor. It's quite funny to watch. So I've been watching him very closely and knew that he was in the middle of the talks since at least late last year, at the request of Rob Malley, our special envoy, because we had hit a roadblock in trying to get the Iranians to say yes. So Malley said, let's ask the Russians to take over and see what they can do. Obviously, the Russians negotiated this deal to their benefit. And as we've taken a close look of how Russia plays a role in the Iran nuclear deal, we find billions of dollars they would be paid to construct additional nuclear power plants in Iran. They would take possession potentially of enriched uranium and have the ability to return it anytime to the regime to threaten the United States. They would also be in a key position to evade international sanctions on Russia. How exactly, do you ask? What does that have to do with Russia sanctions? I'll explain that very briefly. If we have secondary sanctions in place at some point on the Central Bank of Russia, or on Sberbank, or on Gazprom Bank, or on Russian energy sectors, etc., and Russia goes into Iran and says, hey, let's have the Central Bank of Iran work with the Central Bank of Russia to evade US and international sanctions on the Central Bank of Russia. And let's say we've done this nuclear deal, and part of the nuclear deal lifts Central Bank of Iran sanctions. That's on the table. And also for the entire financial sector and other sectors of Iran's economy. Let's say we do that, and we say to the Iranians, hey, we have evidence you are helping Russia evade sanctions. The Central Bank of Iran is working with the Central Bank of Russia and other sanctioned Russian entities. We're going to reimpose sanctions on you, as we would any other company or bank in the world, because you're violating US sanctions against Russia. Well, guess what? That won't happen, because the Iranians get to say, no, we have blanket immunity on the sanctions relief. You try reimposing sanctions on any of these entities that get sanctions relief under the Iran deal, we'll restart enriching uranium. So what will the Biden administration do? They'll say, okay, we'll issue a national security waiver because we can't afford to lose this deal. They're clearly already afraid of Iran's enrichment, not willing to deter them. So why would we believe they would threaten to reimpose sanctions if Iran threatens to restart enrichment? Which means Vladimir Putin has a get-out-of-jail-free card sitting in Tehran. If you go forward with this nuclear deal, it will be a sanctions evasion hub for Russia in Iran. That's a big deal, and members of Congress on both sides of the aisle are aware of this now. and it is contributing to the backlash against the administration's policy. Number two, the IRGC itself. It's an interesting development that we went through this whole escapade of will we remove the IRGC from the FTO list, and the president finally landing after several weeks and saying he will not, which is a good move. But more interesting is that in that process, he said multiple times through spokespeople and senior officials that the IRGC Quds Force is a terrorist organization. The Quds forces are terrorists, he is quoted as saying. Mr. President, if that is correct, and you view the IRGC and its Quds Force as terrorists, as a terrorist organization, why then is Robert Malley, the special envoy for Iran, offering to lift terrorism sanctions of the United States on the IRGC's main financiers, the Central Bank of Iran, the National Iranian Oil Company, its tanker company, its petrochemical company, on down a very long list? This is not me talking. This is the Treasury Department's own dossier that was made public in 2019 and in 2020 when those terrorism sanctions were imposed on those institutions. So, Mr. President, if you say the IRGC is a terrorist organization and the Quds Force are a bunch of terrorists, why would you lift sanctions, terrorism sanctions, for their chief financiers? We now have a really big contradiction inside the offer on the table. And that is something the members of Congress need to push on very hard, very quickly, because I think that offer remains on the table today. Number three, we talked about Russia, we talked about the IRGC. I want to talk about a nuclear development as well. You've probably seen some breaking news from the Wall Street Journal today on this as well. All of this related to the undeclared nuclear activities, the ongoing concealment and illicit activities inside Iran's nuclear program. We see what Iran wants us to see for whatever purposes Iran has. When it ratchets it up enrichment and declares that it's going to 20% or 60% or reopening Fordo or testing advanced centrifuges, it is telling us that because they want us to know about it. They want to shake us down. That's part of the extortion campaign. But it's telling that they don't tell us everything. There are elements of the nuclear program they continue to conceal. Where are certain nuclear materials? Where is certain nuclear equipment? Where are containers we saw in commercial satellite imagery just a couple short years ago? What are these sites that have been discovered? Why is there nuclear material at them? Where is any of the nuclear material source today? They won't answer any of these questions to Rafael Grossi, the Director General of the IAEA. Now we've learned that back as far as 2003, 2004, 2005, they were already compromising IAEA documents, allegedly, according to these reports, potentially contained in the nuclear archive. We found now evidence that Iran has breached the IAEA in the past so that they could figure out what do they already know about our program and how can we start hiding it better? How can we start coming up with stories that potentially fit into what the IAEA may or may not suspect to make our lie that much more believable? Well, guess what? What has happened since 2018, since the nuclear archive was discovered, and the ongoing investigation into undeclared activities has shown us, is that their lies do not add up. They are lies. They are concealing today an illicit nuclear program. And so it is incumbent upon us to understand and to talk to our leaders and say, how could you go into a nuclear deal that lifts sanctions on Iran, that provides international legitimacy to an enrichment program and to a robust nuclear program, when the Director General of the IAEA says he can't get answers to undeclared nuclear activities? That is going to come before the United States coming up on June 6th, when we go back to Vienna for another round of the Board of Governors meeting of the IAEA. The Director General is expected to report back on his findings in this investigation. It's going to be a very big deal, a big thing to watch. And I think another major impediment potentially to going back to a nuclear deal. I've spoken for a while now, covered a lot of ground. I want to hear your question, so I'll pause there.
Okay, my first question is, in testimony this morning, our special envoy, Robert Malley, to the talks in Vienna, had said that up until Trump left the JCPOA, Iran was in full compliance. Richard, was Iran in full compliance up until the time that Trump left the JCPOA?
No, and this is where he's being very deceitful, Mr. Malley. Iran was in violation of their central commitments to be honest about their nuclear program from the very beginning. And so what we proved by understanding that they were hiding a nuclear archive, a nuclear weapons archive in 2018, that they are hiding nuclear sites today, that they are hiding nuclear activities. This didn't just start in 2019 during the maximum pressure campaign. This has been an ongoing campaign of concealment before, during, and after the JCPOA, right? This is a long, long line of concealment that goes back now nearly 20 years. And so the central pillar of the JCPOA was Iran coming clean to the international community, to the IAEA, about their nuclear program, about what they had worked on, what they might still be working on. You cannot verify a nuclear program absent a full accounting of the program. That is a fundamental flaw of the JCPOA. That is a basic truth of nuclear nonproliferation. You will never know what they had, what they may still have, what is out there, what they could be working on, unless you have a verifiable and complete accounting of their past and present activities. So no, they were not in compliance with the JCPOA. They were not in compliance with the NPT, more importantly. So obsessed with the JCPOA, the NPT is the baseline. It is the crux of the entire global nonproliferation world. And if you allow regimes to be in breach of the NPT, who cares about some political agreement? It's the NPT, and that is what they are in breach of today.
Right. Perfect. I recall former Secretary of State John Kerry had said that once we reached an agreement, as they did in 2015 with Iran for the JCPOA, that will bring them into the community of nations and curb their malign behavior. How well has that worked out, Rich?
Well, obviously not well. I mean, that's a fool's errand. Unfortunately, Rob Malley does believe that still. There is an ideology that is perpetrated by people like Rob Malley. That's not just Iran, by the way. He believes this of Hezbollah. He believes this of Hamas. He has said that in interviews in the past, that this is not a terrorist sponsoring regime. These are not terrorist organizations. They are misunderstood. Their activities are prompted by threats we have created, that we provoke, Israel provokes. So, the idea that if you just made nice with the Iranians, with this Islamic Republic regime, that all would be well. We just need to stop threatening them, right? Why do they have nuclear capable ballistic missiles? Because they're under threat of missiles in the region. Of course, that's what they say. Oh, baloney. What do they need a nuclear tipped ICBM for that they keep working on to reach continental United States of America? That's insane. What do they need a missile force to attack a country that's not even on their border in the state of Israel? Why are they even threatened? Why would they invest in terrorist proxies to surround the state of Israel, a country that doesn't even border them, wasn't involved in the Iran-Iraq war, right? So this idea that all of their malign activities are somehow justified, and all we need to do is deconflict, de-escalate, show our willingness to cooperate, and we could have just this wonderful ally and partner in the Middle East, in the Islamic Republic, is halfway between crazy and dangerous. And so I think that's, the truth of the matter is they continue to invest in terrorism. They continue to sponsor terrorism during the JCPOA. Their testing of ballistic missiles increased during the JCPOA, did not decrease. They took the money we gave them and they invested in their nuclear infrastructure, their R&D on advanced centrifuges, their sponsorship of terrorism. They dug into Syria. They dug into Yemen. They tried to take control of the government of Iraq. They surrounded the state of Israel. Thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of precision-guided munition kits flooding into southern Lebanon to make the lethality of the force Hezbollah has against Israel that much more lethal. So no, the JCPOA, in the time we had to measure, did not moderate this regime. It simply gave them more ammunition.
Exactly. All right. And my final question to you before I turn this over to my wonderful colleague, Hussein Abubakar Mansour, is what would you suggest people listening can do to prevent this deal, which will be basically a pathway to a nuclear weapon for Iran?
Listen, I think it's about asking key questions. If you talk to your members of Congress, ask them these questions as well. Put it to them. And that's really who's going to have a voice in this. Rob Malley was asked if he would submit the deal as a treaty, said he would follow the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act. It's still out to lunch if he's actually planning to submit the deal to the Congress, even under that act for review. But the Congress is going to have to insist on oversight. And these are critical questions we are raising. Russia's role in the deal, the undeclared nuclear activities, sanctions relief for the IRGC when you remove terrorism sanctions on its top financiers. These are the types of questions that members of Congress need to answer. And if there comes time for a vote, which they should insist on, if these answers don't come, because by the way, they can't come because I've already told you the answers, the only answer is to reject this deal. And if for some reason there is no vote that's put forward to the Congress, or somehow the votes fall short, hold firm. We should have commitments to reimpose terrorism sanctions on terror financiers. That should be a basic idea in counterterrorism in general. I don't care if it's in Iran or somewhere else. If you are financing terrorism, we should have terrorism sanctions imposed on you to squeeze that ability to do so. If there is a regime that is in non-compliance with the NPT, then there needs to be broad international sanctions brought from the Security Council, from the United States Congress, from our allies, to force compliance with the NPT, whether you have a JCPOA or not. And if there are going to be Russia sanctions in place, we need to make clear in the law that no country has immunity from breaking our sanctions with Russia. And if we find evidence that Iranian banks or companies help Vladimir Putin evade pressure, you better believe we should have it mandatory. No way out for the president to reimpose those sanctions.
Excellent. We actually, late breaking development is today in testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Robert Malley did say that he would comply with the NARA, Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act of 2015, and he would submit it to Congress. Of course, we believe that this has the status of a treaty and it should be submitted to the Senate for 2/3 vote, but I doubt that that would ever happen.
Well, I would just caution, we should all look at the transcript very closely for his words, because his words are chosen very carefully. He will comply with the NARA. Not necessarily that he will submit to the Congress. He will comply with the NARA, leaving open the possibility they will say this is simply the old agreement and we are not required to submit to the Congress.
Okay, awful. All right, and now it is my supreme pleasure to turn the podium over to my phenomenal colleague, Hussein Abubakar Mansour, who will field some of the questions that have come in and perhaps pose some of his own. Hussein?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you very much, Richard, for such a timely presentation. And thank you for all our audience who sent us questions. Please keep sending us your questions and we will read them. As you may imagine, we've received actually a number of questions about the hearing this morning. So have you had the chance to actually follow the hearing, Richard?
I've seen the highlights. One of my colleagues is testifying, I think, right now, Mark Dubowitz. Right. But I have seen some of the highlights of back and forth, and I must say Senator Menendez continues a very strong leadership on this issue, as you may know, or your viewers may not know. When I was working for Senator Mark Kirk in the Senate, working on those Iran sanctions you mentioned as the lead Republican negotiator, my counterpart was Senator Menendez's office. He's been a leader on these issues for many, many years, opposed the Iran nuclear deal, and is continuing to do yeoman's work, raising these types of questions and pushing back, stronger than many Republicans, quite frankly, on the Iran nuclear deal today.
Amazing. Well, one of the questions we received asking you actually for your takeaways or your insights from those parts you watched. You already said, I think, something very important, which is watching Malley's wording carefully. What other insights did you get from those highlights?
Listen, I think this is a person who's really struggling to justify why he even still exists as a position in government and why he should still have a job. The U.S. Senate rejected his negotiating position overwhelmingly on a bipartisan vote. Just a couple weeks ago, there were 2 motions to instruct put forward to a China bill. These are symbolic, largely political, non-binding votes of the U.S. Senate, but they tell you where senators are, where they're lining up, and where a potential vote in the future, if there was a submission to Congress, could end up. One of the most important votes was the Lankford motion to instruct, and it said that that the Senate's position would be that there should not be any nuclear deal, no lifting of sanctions on Iran for any deal that didn't cover Iran's ballistic missile activity, its sponsorship of terrorism, its involvement in the region, and of course any sort of IRGC sanctions That had a 60-vote threshold to pass, which is your typical cloture threshold, which is what we recalled from 2015. Did not allow the rejection of the Iran nuclear deal to move forward. 62 votes in favor, including the majority leader, Chuck Schumer, showing a real bipartisan rejection of where Rob Malley has taken these talks. Another motion to instruct from Senator Cruz passed with almost 90 votes, right? Even more overwhelmingly, saying it was a national security priority to keep Central Bank of Iran sanctions in place. Again, major rejection of the Malley position. He has offered to lift and provide access to Central Bank of Iran funds to Iran. So what did I hear today? I heard a lot of the same talking points that have gotten us nowhere to date. Blame the Trump administration, blame maximum pressure for everything you see today. Say that critics of the deal are exaggerating. It's not true. There was one point where somebody cited Mark Dubowitz's testimony that Iran stands to get $800 billion under this deal between now and 2031. These are estimates from my colleague, Saeed Ghassemdinejad, who is a PhD expert in Iran's economy and its markets and trade. Those are his estimates from the oil and non-oil trade combined. And Malley said, these are all exaggerations. This isn't true. This isn't true. Okay. Well, this is the same person, by the way, who last year, when asked, how can you lift terrorism sanctions, said those were imposed improperly. They're not real terrorism sanctions. They're political. And then when confronted with the evidence that, in fact, no, there are dossiers of these institutions financing terrorism, he just wouldn't answer the question and said, well, they're inconsistent with the JCPOA. This is the same person who turned over the negotiations to Russia for months now, until we all found out about it because we started asking questions about what are we doing with the Russians after they invaded Ukraine. So I don't think he has any credibility left on Capitol Hill, quite frankly, maybe with Senator Murphy and a couple others who are champions of returning to the Iran nuclear deal. But for the vast majority, if you look at the voting roll call on the Langford and Cruz amendments particularly, you will see political support for the Malley posture and negotiating position having completely collapsed in the United States Senate.
Speaking of blaming Trump and maximum pressure campaign, we received a few questions about this because we heard that in the hearing multiple times, repeated, many times, but several people. And there's a question of, this is now so politicized that it's really hard to see, is there any genuine or any sincerity in this constant blaming of Trump for leaving the JCPOA? What's your own opinion?
Listen, all this is now is just a Democratic talking point of throwing the word Trump in just to see if it helps them politically. Because, 16 months ago, you could have gotten an argument that we're in a bad position today because of Donald Trump, because you just took over, right? You're not in charge. It's not your policy. You're inheriting a policy, and you can blame anything you want on Donald Trump at that time. You could probably do that throughout the last year. But when you cross the threshold into a new year, and you've been in office more than a year, when you're making policy decision after policy decision, right? They've gone through 4 IAEA Board of Governors meetings, March, June, September, November. They're coming up on their 5th as an administration, where they didn't hold Iran accountable for anything. They've gone an entire year. Today, they just, right before Malley took the podium, they announced some new sanctions on an IRGC oil illicit scheme. Very smart, political savvy move. Give him something to say they've done on the sanctions enforcement side. But the truth is, on the cargoes that benefit the Iranian economy, they've allowed Iranian oil to skyrocket in exports to China throughout the last year and year plus. They have not taken, in fact, they've issued waivers to Capitol Hill to give Iran access to Central Bank of Iran funds to pay its debts to foreign creditors. So unfortunately, when you make all these decisions over more than a year, at some point, the buck stops in the Oval Office with the current occupant. It's really difficult to say all of this is because of Trump. Maximum pressure is failing. Well, that would be interesting if we had maximum pressure. We don't have maximum pressure. We haven't had maximum pressure for 16 months. So what policy is he pointing to? So that's why I think increasingly this is getting more and more disingenuous, right? Energy prices on the rise, inflation, Russia, Afghanistan, all these issues. People aren't saying, oh, this is because of Trump, right? It's disconnected. The farther and farther you get from the past administration, the harder and harder it is to assign blame for your own policy failures. We saw that, by the way, the same tactic was used by the Obama administration, where they would blame Bush right? Because of Bush's opinion, favorable ratings or disfavorable ratings after he left office. You heard that a lot. Oh, we inherited this from Bush. This is because of Bush. This is because of Bush. It just, at some point, it doesn't work anymore because people say, you know what? I don't like where we're going today. I don't like this policy. And this isn't Trump's policy. It's your policy, Mr. President.
With today's White House announcement that President Biden is firmly now opposed to taking off the IRGC from the FTO, does this mean that there is some hope that the Biden administration is going to harden its position in the negotiations or not?
I think more likely there remains hope for the Iranians that there is a deal to be had in the future. Listen, I don't think anything has materially changed here, right? The deal, as I described it earlier, is an incredible deal for Tehran. We don't know what else they have squeezed out of the administration because the president said, I won't do this. And so clearly we know there was back and forth offers and counter proposals on the IRGC itself. There was reportedly a proposal to remove the IRGC entirely, but replace it with a narrower designation of the Quds Force. There were machinations of which terrorism sanctions could be relieved from affiliates of the IRGC, licenses that could be issued by OFAC, the Treasury Department office that enforces sanctions, to allow money to flow to designated entities regardless of their designation status. So I think there's a lot of issues there at play. And in the end, who knows what else they've come through channels to say, well, if you give us more of this, or if you give us one more thing, or if you relieve this kind of sanction, we'll do the deal. So I wouldn't let down anyone's guard right now. It's great to see the president made this decision. I think the correct next question then to prove whether or not this deal is going forward is, Mr. President, if you are standing firm on the IRGC and you believe they are a terrorist organization, will you order Rob Malley to withdraw any offer to lift sanctions on their chief financiers, the central bank, the oil company, tanker company, the petrochemical company, and all the other banks and companies identified by the Treasury Department for financing the Quds Force and the IRGC? If he will not do that, the deal is definitely still on the table.
So a lot of Democrats in Congress insist that the deal is the only way possible. There is absolutely, and the word absolutely here is emphasized, absolutely no alternative. I think I heard an exceptionally bright analogy today in the hearing that if we're given a 3/4 of a burger, we should take it, because otherwise we're going to have no burger. So the way that it's framed, that there's absolutely no alternative, the alternative would be going to a total war with Iran, because a military strike is really not going to stop the Iranian nuclear program. What is your comment about this?
Well, first of all, how outrageous to wait 16 months and let Iran escalate its nuclear program on your watch and do nothing about it for 16 months, but offer more and more money. And then 16 months later, when the escalation is so high, come and say, oh my gosh, the escalation is so high, we have no other choice but to just give them more money, right? There's no self-reflection that perhaps you are responsible for where we have gotten to today. There are no perfect analogies here, but I'm thinking like, a person with a potentially terminal illness that could still be treated early on comes to the doctor and says, can you save me? And they say, no, we should wait. And he comes back and say, can you save me? No, we should wait. No, can you save me? No, we should wait. And then they're finally in the final stage of the disease, and they come back to the doctor and say, can you save me? They say, no, I'm sorry, it's too late. It's like outrageous. And so, first of all, we should reject that kind of talk because we know it's not true. I think Rob Malley perhaps alluded to the idea that we don't have a military solution to this problem. That's false. That's actually flat out false. We should know that we do have a military solution to this problem. It's a matter of political will. If we want to use that, it should be our last resort, but we do have a military option to this problem. So to say that we don't have that is outrageous as well. But again, what a false dichotomy here. The same one that was created when we had this Iran deal discussion to begin with. It's this deal or war. It's this deal or a nuclear bomb in Iran. Just reject it. So long as there is a credible threat of military force as a bottom line, and we are prepared to use all the tools of power we have, non-military first, to push Iran, squeeze Iran to give up these illicit activities, then we have hope. if we're not willing to ever use military force, whether there's a JCPOA or not, by the way, this is an underlying problem with Rob Malley's position. If he says there's no military option, and that's his view, then you can do as many JCPOAs as you want. The message to Tehran is, let's go nuclear.
You said right now that for the past 16 months, there have been no maximum pressure campaign on Iran. Rob Malley, on the other hand, this morning, I think several times, he said, we haven't lifted any of the sanctions. Everything's still the same. The sanctions are all still there. Who should we believe? Or are we mishearing what he's saying?
So they have, over time, if you go over 16 months, rolled out very, I would call, scalpel sanctions, where they have found an individual or a network, perhaps in Syria or Lebanon, a couple of Chinese firms disconnected from real pressure on the Chinese, and they have, at certain times, rolled out some designations. That is true. On the actual enforcement of our sector-based sanctions on Iran's economy, on the central bank of Iran, on Iran's oil exports, its petrochemical exports, its non-oil exports, right? It's commercial trade. There is no evidence of enforcement whatsoever, none. And so, in fact, quite the contrary, there is a document sent to Capitol Hill by the administration called a waiver, which lifts sanctions to allow Iran access to money. And they've done that multiple times for different reasons. So no, they've done just enough to have a bullet point to cite and say, well, look, we have 70 sanctions we've issued since we've become president or something like that. Now, what is the economic impact of any of those sanctions on Iran? What has happened to Iran's oil exports during that time? What has happened to their petrochemical exports, their non-oil exports? Those are answers he doesn't want to give you or anyone, because it's not a good story, because the actual money going to Iran is going up, not down, under this administration. And again, maximum pressure is not just economic. Maximum pressure is all tools of government pressure. Political pressure. What have we done at the IAEA since they came into office? Nothing. Right? This is a nuclear escalation game, and we have done nothing at the IAEA. There are undeclared nuclear activities the entire time he's been in office. We have done nothing at the IAEA. What have they done at the Security Council to snap back UN sanctions? Nothing. Right? What have they done in the military space to push back on attacks against American citizens, against American soldiers, against our allies? Almost nothing. 2 pinpoint strikes on the Syrian-Iraq border against people that the Iranians don't care about. So no, there has been no maximum pressure for 16 months. There is no maximum pressure today. And to claim otherwise is very misleading.
We have a question actually about, I don't know if you're familiar, have any insights on this, but the Saudi-Iranian back channels that they've been opening, and there have been some meetings between foreign ministers. Is there an actual chance of some sort of a reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, even if it's limited in some areas, but that will change the dynamics in the region?
I don't think so. I think there has been some pro forma discussions at a very low level through foreign ministries at the request and urging of the Biden administration. Those have gone nowhere. In fact, quite to the opposite. You've seen very vocal outcry from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia with respect to maintaining the IRGC designation as an FTO. You've seen both Saudis and the Emirates come together in the face of increased attacks by the Houthis, sponsored by the IRGC in Iran, trained and armed by the IRGC against their capitals, against their people. And so, quite frankly, I see a pretty unified voice from the region against going back to the Iran nuclear deal. Now, there was a statement that Rob Malley was able to extract from the GCC late last year, which people will point to, what Malley will point to, that they signed a statement that basically called on the international community. It was issued with the U.S. To recognize that Iran's terror activities are outrageous, that they have to be stopped, that the attacks on Saudi and UAE are outrageous. They wanted the political impact of that statement. And Rob Malley insisted that the statement at the end say everybody's for a full compliance with the JCPOA and a return to JCPOA. Otherwise, he wouldn't sign off on the U.S. endorsing the statement. So they went along with that statement. But beneath those sorts of Mali-induced statements, it's quite clear in conversations. They are very clear-eyed on the threat posed by the Islamic Republic, and they will be increasing their cooperation with their Gulf partners, but also, I hope, with Israel to meet the increasing threat, whether we have a JCPOA or not.
Also, Malik in the hearing mentioned several times that, and it was in the news reports, that there are IDF generals and former generals who came out against the maximum pressure campaign and said it was the biggest mistake, biggest threat to the security of Israel in a very long time. How big is this opinion among the Israeli security apparatus? Is this the actual opinion of the security apparatus, or is it a minority or a majority opinion?
Yeah, I actually saw in recent weeks a statement put out by an organization that represents hundreds of former generals and senior defense officials with Yossi Cooperwasser, which some of you may know. I think he is a key coordinator of that group. I got some press coverage in which they said there may be a couple outliers that some people in America have found and have elevated their voices, but the overwhelming majority of the so-called security establishment of Israel is very much opposed to the Iran nuclear deal and remains opposed to returning to anything like it or something worse, as is what's on the table. Now, if you went into an IDF planning meeting and you talked to a couple of analysts and they gamed out the region and what would happen in sort of the next month, the next year of planning, and what are the strategic implications of no deal, and what are the strategic implications of a conflict in the next year, and having to face a multi-front campaign, the threats they face in southern Lebanon, the threats they face in Syria and in Gaza, potentially even from Yemen, all combined with Iran's threats themselves, right? You'd have an interesting picture there in discussion. But short-term military planners can never replace long-term political leaders. And it is incumbent upon political leadership and smart-minded security leaders to think about what is the existential threat caused by a return to the nuclear deal? What are the alternatives? And I think we've heard from the vast majority of Israeli officials, all the conversations I've ever had, is very strongly opposed to a return to the nuclear deal.
As we're reaching the end of our times, I'll try to combine many questions together. There's a question about the current relationship with the Biden administration with our Gulf allies. Obviously, there's been a simmering tensions in the relationship between Saudi Arabia and between us and Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis. What is the current situation of the administration's relationship? There were news that Biden was considering actually visiting MBS in person to mend fences. Do you have any insights into this?
Yeah, I actually think we have a major opportunity here as the U.S. Side to reset the relationship in a positive way with Saudi Arabia, and do so in a way that actually forges furtherance of the Abraham Accords and hopefully expansion of the Abraham Accords to include Saudi Arabia. I think the president making clear he would not remove the FTO designation of the IRGC is an important step. I think it would be very helpful if the administration reinstituted the designation of the Houthis on the foreign terrorist organization list. There's no reason they should have been removed. It has backfired removing them. They should be put back on. I think that would go a long way, first of all, for our own national security interests and that of our allies, but also in resetting the relationship. And then I think you're able to really have a conversation about security guarantees for Saudi Arabia, what that means. They may have gripes with the Trump administration. A lot of people point to criticism that Trump didn't come to Saudi Arabia's defense when there was a cruise missile strike on Abaqaiq, the Saudi Aramco facility. Now, I actually think it's defensible why we didn't do that. I think that if you're going to have military action against Iran, you risk losing political support in the Congress and back home very quickly, and that would have collapsed the maximum pressure campaign. But that is a question that still looms over the Saudis and their security planning. So security commitments and guarantees are important. If those are added on alongside some of these important steps, if you don't keep moving towards an Iran nuclear deal, I think that you can also insist on Saudi Arabia coming to the table with certain commitments, not moving towards China, not moving towards Russia, understanding that Russia and China are allied with your mortal enemy, Iran. United States, even in a Biden administration, they're not allies with Iran. At worst, you can say is they're naive, stupid, and going to lift sanctions. But we're not actually actively arming the Iranians. these are not your friends. The United States remains your ally. And I think we need to show that we are an ally. And I think that builds up the credibility to then also say we need a regional security architecture. And let's start finally coming out into the open more and more, and let's normalize relations between Riyadh and Jerusalem.
Well, I'm going to ask you the last question, and it's about what the best case scenario. What is the best case scenario moving forward that we should expect, and what could we do? Our audience, of course, is eager to do anything to help the security of the United States and Israel. So, what is the best case scenario that we should expect, and how could we help?
Well, listen, I think that the Israeli government is taking action already. We're starting to see indications of that. You're starting to see some reports of that. You saw the assassination of an IRGC leader inside Iran. You're seeing reports that the Russian pivot away from Syria to focus on Ukraine is opening up opportunities for the IDF to target more and more inside Syria against IRGC and Iranian targets. I think that will continue to increase. The Iranians probably perceive a vacuum to increase their presence. And I think the Israelis rightly perceive a vacuum to roll back the Iranian presence in Syria without being constrained by Russia if they increasingly pull back from Syria. The threat on the northern border remains very, very high. And so efforts to deal with the precision-guided munition stockpiles of Hezbollah will be important ahead of any potential conflict with Iran that would be a multi-front battle. And I also think we should think about this not just as, there's going to be a strike in the middle of the night, the way we thought about military conflicts in the past. I think this could take a long time. I don't think this could be over in one night. I think they will, in Israel, need the support of their allies militarily and politically. And there will be different venues for this fight. It won't just be kinetic. It will be cyber. It will be information. And so we should prepare for all those contingencies and ensure that Israel has everything it needs if it decides, as a democracy, as an ally, that it has to do what it needs to do to protect itself for the future.
Thank you so much, Rich. I have to just underscore my opening words that you are an intellectual treasure, one of America's, I think, greatest natural resources. And I can't thank you enough for your work and the wonderful work of FDD. So I'd like to tell all of our listeners to please support Ahmet if you'd like this, this sort of programming, and also to please remember to support FDD. I'm sure it's fdd.org, which is, I think, one of the best think tanks in the United States today. And again, it is always a tremendous, tremendous pleasure to have you on and to continue our partnership together. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Okay, be well. Bye-bye.